Good evening, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time. We've got a very esteemed panel, and along with our moderator. Just want to welcome you from Indivisible Las Cruces. We appreciate all that you are here, and we want to have a really good, lively discussion. I know Bill has put together some good questions, plus questions from the audience, on what the demise of the Department of Education is going to mean for you in New Mexico. So I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Bill McCamley.
How's everybody doing tonight, all right? Thursday night's a good night for a little policy talk. I like that. As Pam said, my name is Bill McCamley. For those of you that don't know me, I was a county commissioner, a state legislator, and I was the cabinet secretary for the New Mexico Workforce Solutions Department up until a few years ago. I've been working with Indivisible for the past few months, trying to help with some of the activities, and this is one of the things that we're talking about today. Thank you all very much for coming. Format. We've got some introductions we're going to do with our great panel. I'll be introducing them in a second. I've got 2 questions I'm going to give to them off the bat, and then we'll move to the audience for questions. So if you all have questions and topics you're interested in, we'll have Phil. Where's Phil?
He's out there.
We have a guy who's going to be coming around with a microphone who's going to be taking your questions. We have had issues in the past with people who can't hear, so please wait for a microphone to come to you before you ask questions. Last thing, I'm going to give this a little shout out now and then at the end. See this lovely lady in the back in the blue shirt? That's Mary. Mary is putting together a team of folks called PST, the Public School Support Team. I know we actually have a couple of school board members here this evening. Patrick. Who else am I missing from the school board? Okay, so we have Patrick from the school board here. Thank you very much. But if you are interested in getting involved in school board activities and possibly helping with the election that is coming up this November, please feel free to talk with Mary after we're done today, and she's got a sign-up list outside. Fair enough, everybody? Okay. So, the U.S. Department of Education was founded in 1980. In 2024, it had a budget of $268 billion, which is about 4% of total federal spending. The 4 key missions are identified by the department. They are establishing policies on federal financial aid for education and distributing that money, as well as monitoring funds, collecting data on America's schools and disseminating research, focusing national attention on key issues in education and making recommendations for education reform, and prohibiting discrimination and ensuring equal access to education. Major funding responsibilities include the provision of funds to K-12 schools in serving low-income students, support for special education programs at both the K-12 and higher education levels, and overseeing student aid programs like loans and Pell Grants. Additionally, the department is in charge of overseeing the accreditation process for colleges and universities and runs the National Center for Education Statistics. This is the group responsible for all nationwide data collection on programs from early childhood education all the way to adult and continuing education. Getting rid of the Department of Education has been a long-term goal of some national conservatives. With Project 2025, the game plan set up last year by the Heritage Foundation, specifically calling for it to be dismantled and its responsibility shifted to other departments and states. President Trump has been following this plan closely in his first few months of office, and on March 11th ordered the reduction of workforce at the department by half. He followed that up 2 weeks later on March 20th by declaring his intention to dismantle the department completely and ordering the Secretary of Education to begin that process. Now, the department cannot be dissolved without an act of Congress. He can't just do it unilaterally. He can cut funding, et cetera, and so on. However, a bill has been introduced by a U.S. Rep named Thomas Massey from Kentucky to do so at the beginning of the year. I do not know the status of that bill, but I'm sure those discussions are taking place. Here to discuss what these actions mean to students, parents, educators, and staff locally are 3 absolute experts on the topic. We have Lori Martinez, Ms. Martinez is the Executive Director of Engage New Mexico. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree from NMSU in social work and has experience working in early childhood education, working with individuals with developmental disabilities, mental health counseling, case management, program development, hunger and food security for students and their families, and inpatient psychiatric services. Since 2017, Lori has worked with Engage New Mexico on prenatal to career education systems here in Darien County. Can we give her a hand, please? We have Timothy Hand. Dr. Tim Hand has served in a diverse set of roles in the New Mexico education system. He started as a high school coach. In 2002, he is a tennis coach. His experience spans from teacher and director of various Title V programs, district level administrator, chief of staff right here for the Las Cruces Public School District, the deputy director of the State Legislative Education Study Committee, which I relied on all the time when I was a state legislator for great research, and deputy cabinet secretary for the New Mexico Public Education Department. You poor guy. His experience in these roles as both teaching and learning from high school students in Las Cruces to students across the state sets his priorities squarely on building innovative, community-based educational opportunities for young people to discover their unique gifts and become lifelong learners on the path to meeting their personal aspirations. Can we get a hand for Dr. Hand? Our third august panelist is Kathy Brooks. Dr. Brooks has a bachelor's in mathematics from UC Santa Barbara and a PhD in economics from the University of Texas at Austin. She retired from NMSU in 2020, and her career included both a role as professor of economics and as associate academic dean in the College of Business. Furthermore, she just rotated off as president of the local League of Women Voters and is currently serving on the boards for the Las Cruces chapter and New Mexico chapter of the League, which is a wonderful job. Can we get a hand for Dr. Brooks? So I want to start, Dr. Hand, we'll start with you. Softball question, but also I think important for setting the stage. And this is the same question to each of you. Why did you all enter the education field? And why is it important to each of you that schools and other education programs are supported?
Good evening. It really is a softball because it was my mom's teacher. She taught at, I remember driving to Loma Heights in the morning, down the street. She was a teacher there, and then when Desert Hills opened over on Roadrunner, she was with that first group of kids there, and went all the way through with that, and then actually was a professional development teacher over at Tombo. And that's important for tonight because professional development teachers here in Las Cruces are paid out of Title II funds, which is a federal source. So first implication, we can my mom, so we don't have that. And so I took my first job across the street in 2002 with Las Cruces Public Schools as the tennis coach there, and I've only had three bosses since then, Las Cruces Public Schools, New Mexico State University, and then, as Bill said, I did go up to the state for 5 years, and I was actually 6'5" before I went up there, and didn't have a gray hair on my body. But
At least you still have it.
yeah, so Bill was much more handsome too before he went as well. So, but it's a pleasure to be here, and I guess the real question here is about why did I stick with it? It's a tough gig. Why do we do the 10,000 hours with kids? And I'll tell you about my favorite job that I've had throughout this time. It was a, believe it or not, a Title V grant that we worked on between LCPS and Las Cruces Public Schools. And I was able to teach a summer course of Upward Bound kids. And Upward Bound is a federally funded program for first generation with an academic need, low income, young people here in the state. And it's federal money that came, and I got them for the summer. And then during the school year, we got a Title V grant. I think you follow title, every time I say title, I think federal funding, right? We got a Title V grant. And what I was able to do is all of the kids had my class, right? So there was 18 kids. They were in my class, and then they all took the same chemistry class, and the same math class, and the same English class, right? there at MSU. And so in my class, we would go over things like what did you guys struggle with, right? This last week, how's homework coming? Did you turn it in? What's going on with your friend's situation? What's you guys meeting on each other? And it was cool because for first generation low income students with an academic need, not a good chance once they get to college that they're going to make it through that first year. But we had 17, one young lady had a baby, and 17 of the 18 made it through that first year. And I just think about it on a micro scale, what would have happened if those kids didn't have each other for that first year. And I just know statistically, wouldn't have had as good a chance getting through. And so that's second. So first, would have fired my mom, not cool. Second, those young people wouldn't have had each other for that year. And it's just such a wonderful experience. And so just, even on we'll get to the macro as we go through here, but on a micro scale, that was my favorite job I've ever had, and it would have never existed.
Lori, same question. Why did you get into doing what you're doing, especially coming from social work? And because of that experience, why do you think it's important that public education continues to be supported?
So I actually didn't enter the education field. I went into social work and have ended up throughout my, it's over 20 years now, in all education settings. So starting with early childhood. When I went into social work, I had no intention whatsoever of working with young children and fell into the world of early childhood almost on accident, ended up completely falling in love with it, and it completely changed the trajectory of not only my own understanding of how important early childhood was, but it also changed the trajectory of my career. And so, and not to mention then later when I became a mom, having had that experience has made me a much better parent. So I did 9 years in early childhood, working with young kiddos who had delays or whisper delays, and then kind of hopscotched over to higher ed at MSU for 9 years. I've done small stints in the K-12 system, but now for the last 8 years have been working with Engage New Mexico. And we do all systems, well, started out as all systems work in Domiana County, so we launched something called the Success Partnership back in 2014, 2015, and it was really about bringing together community around this idea of, there was a series of community convenings around the question of if there was one thing that we could really leverage community support and resources towards to increase child well-being, what would that be? And so after a series of community convenings and meetings with a variety of people all over the county, the result was we need to focus on education, but it needs to be the entire system, from prenatal to career. So prenatal, early childhood, K-12, higher ed, career readiness, and really work on addressing those systems together as a community. And so I have been fortunate since 2017 to have been with Engage working on that. Under the Success Partnership, we have an Early Childhood Coalition, and during the pandemic launched the Career Coalition. So we've got our hands in a lot of things with a lot of community members and partners, which you can say right there. Why I stay in it, I have my own daughter who, of course, there's a very personal connection there. My mom, my biological mom, is also an educator who actually did recently lose her job because of the cuts. But the hopeful part for me is just knowing that in New Mexico, there are some really incredible things happening. And even just looking at the last 10 years, in the last 10 years, we have created a designated early childhood department. At the time it formed, New Mexico was one of only 4 states in the country who had done that. We have designated funds towards early childhood. We've got near universal pre-K access. We have made childcare essentially free to families up to 400% of the poverty level. We saw if you're familiar with the K-12 world in New Mexico, then New Mexico was sued actually in 2018 for not abiding by our own state constitution to provide a sufficient and equitable education for all students. And so there have been changes that have happened since then. So there's still a lot of work to do there, but we've seen much more funding influx into New Mexico. We also, because of other things that have happened, we have, for example, a state legislature today that looks more like everyday New Mexicans than it ever has because of the efforts of a lot of people. So we have more people like you and me sitting in our state legislature today than ever. And as a result, we're seeing different kinds of laws getting passed, including those in education. And so I got into the work one way, but I stay now because of the hope and because just a true conviction in doing collaborative work with all the amazing people we have here and in our state who are ready to roll.
To back up Lori, for those of you not familiar, all of the data nationally shows that quality early childhood programs, when done well, have so many positive externalities for communities, be it less special education needs moving forward, better job situations, less people going to jail, etc. and so on. You see this in Illinois, you see it in San Antonio, you see it in the entire state of North Carolina. So what Lori does, especially in her experience with early childhood, that is really, really important. It's one of the best investments any community can make. Moving from the early childhood level to the other end of the education spectrum, we have Dr. Brook. Do you want to tell us a little bit about why you got into higher education and why you think it's important that we support those types of programs as well?
Sure. I graduated from college with the idea that I was probably going to be a high school math teacher, and applied for a teaching certificate program in California, and I think they had already filled the slots that had available for the upcoming semester. Though I had majored in math, I had gotten interested in economics along the way and saw more of a future in studying economics than math at advanced levels. And so I went to graduate school in economics, got very interested in public policy issues of the sort of kinds. My first teaching experience was as a graduate assistant in graduate school. This was, I had a few courses in economics. I did not have a major in economics. I was handed a thick textbook and told to go teach the class tomorrow morning. So, and 45 years later, I retired from teaching economics. I feel very strongly about the importance of public education. My teaching experience did include 4 years at a private liberal arts college, and that was very interesting to see compared with my personal experiences at large state universities. But I believe strongly in public education. I believe strongly that people who want to attend college should have an opportunity to do that. That serves all of us. We face increasingly complex problems in our world, from affordable housing to healthcare to climate change and so on. And we need educated people. And we also need to keep track of the fact that, as one of our former NMSU presidents used to say, education is about living a life as well as earning a living.
So I have 3 technical questions we're going to start off with, and then we're going to move to the audience. So if you all have questions as these come up, please think about it once we get done with these 3, and we're going to let, I'm going to start with one for each of these panelists and let them kind of converse about it by themselves. If you have questions, we want to save time. So with Phil back there raising his hand, we'll be going around with a microphone here in a little bit. So just think about that. I want to start off with a question for Lori. So the U.S. Department of Education is in charge for the National Center for Education Statistics. This is the organization responsible for measuring educational progress across the country. It has already been gutted in terms of budget and staffing, but if the Department of Education goes away, there doesn't seem to be any plan to replace the services it provides. Can you tell us from your perspective why these measurements are so important to everyday people in our communities, and what will happen if that data is not available anymore? And then if you have some specific examples about how that effect will kind of come down to families and teachers here in Las Cruces.
Well, that's a big one with data. And it's interesting because you think sometimes that the data it's not on the surface always super clear why that's a super important thing, but it's a really important tool that we have. So for this national agency, they've been collecting, analyzing, and reporting data on the condition of U.S. education from early childhood, all the way through adult education to improve student outcomes. It's also worth noting this department has fewer than 200 people. This is not about money, and this is not about government waste. So some examples of the data they provide, they do a ton of data, everything from data dashboards to surveys to you name it. So Common Core data around all 100,000 public and elementary and secondary schools, 18,000 school districts in the country. Longitudinal data systems on the grant program. Early childhood longitudinal, so long-term early childhood studies. A national teacher and principal survey, numerous data assessments of educational progress, and also things like international studies of key adult workplace skills needed. And so it's a huge range. So it obviously, this helps us have comparison data to other states. It helps New Mexico see where we stand in relation to the rest of the country. And so we have a state public education department that does data, but it doesn't have the resources to also do all the data, the comparison data always for New Mexico compared to the rest of the country. It helps us see what's working and what's not. And this is really important in these Department of Education conversations because the Department of Education isn't necessarily the main source of funding for states' education, but a lot of the funding they do provide is funding that helps level the playing field. And so when you take that funding away, you also take the data away, and actually they're targeting these data sources too. And so you stop seeing where these programs that help low income students or English language learners or migrant students or unaccompanied youth, you stop being able to see where those programs are being effective. This data is also a powerful tool and to check against corruption. There's some things we know because of NCES, for example. We know that 31% of public schools this is nationally, are using non-teachers in teaching roles because of staff shortages. In New Mexico, we know the average annual wages of kindergarten versus elementary versus middle school versus high school teachers. We can compare per student spending in New Mexico to other states. We can see trends in school attendance. For example, we can see that in New Mexico between 2019 and 2020, about over 14,000 school-age kids just kind of disappeared. Now we all know what happened in 2020, but we lost about 15,000 school-age students. They haven't come back. Where did they go? We know kids from poor families enter kindergarten with greater skill gaps than kids from wealthy families. We also know things like, thanks to the school survey on crime and safety, we know that students are more likely to be targeted for harassment based on sexual orientation or gender identity in majority white schools. It's not popular data, but it's important, would you say? We know that 1 in 2 parent households have the same difficulty finding childcare. So there's a lot, we dig into the weeds all day long. But what happens if the data isn't available anymore? Obviously, we have to try and get that data from other places. And it's hard to do data well. I think we've probably all seen this in some form or fashion, but data can be misunderstood, it can be misused, and it can be weaponized. And so data done well is hard to do. You have to make sure it's collected well. You have to make sure you have people who know what they're doing so that you're gathering the data you think you're gathering and not accidentally asking the wrong question. You have to make sure it's analyzed and interpreted well and without bias so that people can actually use the data for application. The data disappearing leaves a void thrive to be filled with corrupt practices, and this is where I want to bring us back to the big picture of this administration, because this administration showed us the first time around what they were going for with Betsy DeVos, right? So we saw some of this stuff happen, or it kind of started like in Michigan, and so it's kind of fascinating if you look at the history of like Detroit and Grand Rapids in Michigan. You see the difference between like the traditional public school model, where you have elected school boards, you have teachers who are also allowed to be in unions, you have parent and community involvement, and then you see the, DeVos / now we're seeing round 2, but it's essentially the market version of education. It's privatizing public education. It's really pushing vouchers and school choice, and as we speak, that effort nationally is being rebranded in the federal law to push for vouchers. It pushes billionaire philanthropists, school choice advocates, very conservative legislators generally, but it essentially privatizes our education, and it makes it so that the needs of the few are served by the many instead of the needs of the many being prioritized. And so there's all the data that this national organization provides for us, but also the bigger picture is that it's a massively powerful tool that we have at our disposal to make sure that education serves all students. And it's a check against corrupt practices that we see coming.
That leads us really well into our next question. So Tim, I'd like you to take this one. Lori talked specifically about how data is used to help determine where funding goes across the country because you want to help folks that need the help. New Mexico receives about $134 million every year in what is called Title I money. Now, as we talk about these titles, Title 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, most of these were passed during Lyndon Johnson's administration in the 60s as part of his Great Society programs to really help places around the country that needed the help. And all these titles do different things, but they're basically doing things to help with lower income folks. Title IV, I think, helps with Hispanic serving institutions, those sorts of things. So New Mexico receives about $134 million in Title I money. Various news sources are reporting that if the Department of Education goes away, these funds will be reduced. How do New Mexico schools use these funds, Tim? And what will it mean to districts and therefore students, families, and teachers if the funding dispersed to states is reduced? And can you give some examples of the types of choices that will have to be made by Las Cruces Public Schools and other places around the state?
It's a long question, though.
You're a smart guy.
Let's go. So, I'll start with a number. If you remember one number from tonight, remember the number $579,500,000. $579,500,000. That is the amount of federal funding. We just wrapped up the legislative session here in New Mexico. As of 30 days ago, that was the number, the amount of money that the legislature predicted would flow from the feds to the state and then out to schools. So there's different colors of money for federal funding. There's the flow through, which is the title funds. All the title funds flow from the feds to the state, out to schools. We'll get into that. There's also, I know this personally because my wife administers the National School Lunch Program here at the state. There's $200 million that goes out to feed kids in schools. That is in jeopardy, by the way. There's already some talks about cutting back on that. New Mexico is ahead of the game and actually has universal free and healthy meals for schools here in the state. The state actually subsidizes the money, the $200 million that comes from the feds, to pay for all meals statewide. So we're ahead of the game there, but it might get more expensive if we get fewer federal funds. So that's about $200 million. And then I use the word flow through on the $579 million. You don't have to apply for that. That just comes to your district based on your demographics. There's also some competitive grants. Like I know Las Cruces has a couple community schools grants here for community schools. There's lots of, a tidbit about $100 million worth of competitive grants. So I would be able to tie about $880 million that comes from the feds to K-12 institutions, 880. But the big number is that 579,500. And it's really easy to project what would happen because in education, about 80 cents for every dollar is spent on human beings, right? EAs, teachers, coaches, custodians, facilities.
What does EA stand for?
Educational assistants, the lifeblood of public schools. So, just do the math with me. $579,500,000. Let's say that 70%, let's be conservative. Let's say that 70% of that is used on human beings, right? And that's a conservative, it's probably closer to 80 or 90. To actually hire human beings to help our teachers do their job. So 70%, that's what's exactly $385 million, right? At 70%. Let's say that educational assistants, we actually passed a law that educational assistants can't be paid less than $30,000. So let's use 48. You guys, we can There are some good things happening. That's a good thing. Let's say 48,000 with benefits. That is 8,000 human beings. Would be the cut if none of that federal money flows through. And to give you some context for that, every adult at New Mexico State University and in the 40 schools here in Las Cruces disappeared. Just picture that. It's that many people that federal funds pay for in New Mexico. So what will happen is just proportionally, based upon how much the cut is, there will be that many fewer people. I called Roberto at the Las Cruces Public Schools today, and I said, "What do you use your Title I funds on?" He said, "People. You can't spend more than 90% on people, but they try to get right up to that threshold. So it's pretty easy to kind of picture what would happen. And then the reality of it is, I read the bill. There's a proposal to send title funds out through block grants to schools. They didn't say how much money would be in those block grants, right? But it would be basically go to the Department of Treasury, and then Treasury would send it out to states, and states would split it up. When you talk about where all this began, with it was the passing, I think it was 64, of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The reason behind federal title funds was to serve the students who need it the most, right? The low-income students, students with disabilities, students that really need the most support. I think we're going to be, if it's a block grant and it's the same amount of money, I think school boards like Patrick's group, I think the legislature that Lori talked about here in New Mexico, I think we can figure out how to make sure that those young people are served. I worry, I don't know anything about other places. I don't know how that would go, but that's one of the things I worry about. But what it is, it's 8,000 people. What it's used for, it's those people are educational assistants, they help our students with disabilities, ancillary services. Just picture all the human beings in LCPS and all the human beings in NMSU, all those people dispersed throughout the state to help the young people that need it the most. That would be the impact of any cuts. It's hard to tell how many, but there's some tension. Because the Department of Education, the federal Department of Education, there's tension there. The experiment didn't work with standardized education, right? To have the feds come through and say, this is the standardized test, this is the standardized curriculum, this is the Common Core.
And that was No Child Left Behind.
No Child Left Behind, yeah. And the department was tasked with administering that, which kind of got away from that initial, let's make sure that we're taking care of the kids that need it the most. There were some equity roots in there, but there's some room for New Mexico. I don't want to say that it's all bad. There is some room for New Mexico to take some leadership and having a more community-based education, for sure, for those connections to what kids are learning to be important to their individual communities. That there's an opportunity there, but with 8,000 fewer people, that makes it really tough.
To Tim's point, when block grants became a thing in the 90s in the Congress, the theory was, okay, we're not going to let the federal, you see almost this exact same language being used today, which is, we'll send all this money just out to the state, but we're going to send less because we're going to let the states do it, they're going to be more efficient and effective. So if they have the same kind of language, there's a good possibility that could be the same strategies. We'll send it out to you, but we're going to send less because we'll think you'll be more efficient with it. So that's just something to think about. Moving on to Kathy. NMSU's main campus has an enrollment of roughly 15,000 students, with Darkiana Community College having another 9,000 or so credit students. Around 90% of these first-time students receive some kind of financial aid, with about 60% of those first-time students at each campus on a Pell Grant, a program administered by the Department of Education. While President Trump has said programs shouldn't be affected, as responsibility would theoretically be transferred from the Department of Education to the Department of Commerce for Pell Grants and other types of financial aid, staff cuts have many worried that the programs could cease to be effective because there won't be enough people or staff expertise to get the students the money effectively. As a former administrator, you were associate dean. Can you talk about what challenges students might see if these worries do become real?
Okay. Pell Grants are grants and aid, that they are not loans. So you have a Pell Grant program and you have federal student loans, two separate things. The attractive thing about Pell Grants is that the student who receives the grant does not ever have to repay those funds. What universities try to do, universities like NMSU, is package financial aid in a way to serve the student. So Pell Grants would be a component of that package for those students who, in the words of the Pell Grant, have exceptional financial need. So these are very restricted funds. The amount that students receive depends on a number of factors. It's not easy to come up with an income figure and say that if your income is below this amount, you qualify for a Pell Grant. If it's above this amount, you don't qualify. It takes into account a number of factors, including the cost of attendance at the school that you are trying to attend. So a Pell Grant may be part of the package. A federal student loan might be part of the package. In New Mexico, we have the lottery and opportunity scholarships that might be a piece of the whole thing. So the financing of a college education can be fairly complex. The maximum Pell Grant for this coming year is about $7,400. The minimum is 10% of that amount, so $740. So any disturbance to the package means that you're going to be, or your student is going to be looking for ways to fill in the gaps. I know enough about financial aid to know that if someone were to ask me a question about their specific circumstances, I should send them to somebody with expertise. So financial aid offices know better how to answer these questions than a dean in a college, for example. It's complicated. The circumstances of students are probably very different from the circumstances of small businesses who are trying to get assistance through the Department of Commerce. So these kinds of disruptions to the process, even if they work themselves out in the long run and there's no cut in funding, they cause a lot of trauma to individuals trying to figure out how the system works. It will likely disrupt enrollments, in turn disrupting the staffing at universities and colleges. So it's a pretty difficult situation, and like much of what's going on right now, it's the uncertainty as much as anything that is hard to grapple with.
That's a good answer, thank you. Those are the 3 prepared questions I have. I have some other topics, but does anybody have a question for our panel from the audience? Yeah, we want to start over here. Hold on. And for everybody talking, if you could just give your first name, let everybody know who you are, and then what your question is.
Hi, my name is Katya. Hello.
Use your teacher voice.
Now we're trying to get the microphones.
Hello?
There you go.
Okay. So if you could answer this question as though you were part of my case, but talking to somebody who's not familiar with all the details of policy, sort of maybe just has some broad ideas about things. From the point of view of someone who supports abolishing the Department of Education, that's not me, but if you wanted to talk to somebody, what are the top reasons that that person might support that position, and how would you argue against them? Again, in terms, not deep policy terms, but in broader terms. So how can we talk to our neighbors who, like, what are they likely to say to us, and what can we say back to them?
So to take the counter, it's a really easy pitch. It's school boards should be making decisions about young people, not DC, right? That's the sales pitch. There's a lot of truth to that, and there's some common ground to be had there. The value of the Department of Education goes back to its original premise, which was to shine, it's like a flashlight, to shine light on inequities in school systems, right? To make sure that the curriculum, that the instruction, that the resources are being spent to help the kids who need it the most. There's a middle ground there, besides abolishing the department, right? And along with it, a lot of that accountability and a lot of that oversight. And part of it comes down to making sure that our state has strong policy and strong statute around Title IX, right? Title IX right now, it used to be just male, female, gender, athletics, those types of things, but it really comes down to now, your local school board, in the absence of this federal oversight, must have strong equity policies. Your local state must have policies in place that will do the same thing that the federal department was meant to do. And I think the common ground that you could have with someone that is coming and saying we want local control of education is to just make sure, because if you talk to the National Education Association, or the largest union in the United States, they're not a fan of the standardized education curriculum. They're not a fan of the standardized tests. They're not a fan of this top-down, one education for everyone. And so there's some middle ground there too, in how local school boards and local states can have more of a say in their education. But the solution is not to just blow it up. We've got to find some sort of middle ground in between to make sure that the federal accountability, and the money's always been the carrot, by the way, to make sure that this equity happens. It's not I gotta tell you, it's not what they write down in the laws. It's the money that comes with it. That if you get the federal funds, you have to make sure that you can say, what's the difference between Anglo and Hispanic scores in tests, right? You have to actually submit that to the feds in order to get the money. And so to make sure that there's some sort of conversation about still having equity without that, but to have some of the accountability right here. I see a couple of our school board members who would take that head on, actually, to make sure that we have equitable educational practices here locally would be part of the common ground that you could talk through someone. Because I gotta tell you, as someone who, I was a guy that had to write the plans and the reports to submit to the feds for the state, a lot of it, I have to tell you, would be better served locally here in Las Cruces. And a lot of it would be better served to the Regis Pecos is the former governor of the Cochise Pueblo. And we're a unique state when it comes to local needs, and in our indigenous nations, people who thought they knew better came in to these communities, right? Put their young people in boarding schools and shoved a curriculum down their throat, right? And cut their hair, took their clothing, and took their identity. that is not what anyone wants. And so it's easy to weaponize that when saying that we're getting rid of the Federal Department of Education. But we have to remember that the Federal Department of Education was founded in 1964 to not have those sort of equity issues in schools. So getting the department back to that job, I think, would be a middle ground.
Yeah, Ken.
I would just say that the solution that's been proposed of eliminating the Department of Education is a solution to what? I think we could organize our education activities at the federal level in a variety of ways. One of which would be to have a freestanding Department of Education like we do now. Before the freestanding department, education was in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. What we have is a solution in search of a set of problems, and you know, part of the issue is that the people proposing the solution are not necessarily straightforward about what it is they're trying to accomplish. We can't evaluate them very readily because they don't tell us what they're trying to achieve. They suggest that life will go on, you know, with student loans being handled by the Commerce Department, and it's just somehow more efficient. I think there's room for common ground on discussing how to organize the federal government, but I'm not sure that's what this is all about.
I think what I would add to that is that this gets framed as a very all or nothing kind of problem, right? You keep the Department of Ed or you get rid of it. And the fact is our systems are more complicated than that, right? And so I think for us it's about, one of the things I appreciate about Tim is he often reminds us not to be on the hunt for silver bullet solutions. Because when we do that, you miss so much, right? You're looking for like that one miracle answer. So often the problems weren't caused by one thing, they're not going to be fixed by one thing either. And so I think if we view the Department of Ed as one tool in our toolbox, along with our public education department, along with our local communities, our local school boards. And the answer isn't necessarily, I don't think, to necessarily just throw out the baby with bathwater, get rid of the Department of Education. It's how can we improve things? And you know, like people have mentioned, there are numerous kind of options at our disposal here, right? Is the Department of Ed going to come and go? We don't know that for sure yet. We know there's a whole lot of chaos happening around us right now that we're trying to A, keep up with, and B, figure out what we can do about it, right? But I think we need to use every tool in our toolbox, and not necessarily think about eliminating it, but how can we make it better? Because the Department of Ed, as Tim alluded to, does have a complex history. How many of you know why New Mexico, along with Arizona, weren't made states until 1912? We were U.S. territories by the mid-1800s, weren't made states until 1912. Anyone know why?
Because we spoke another language.
Basically, our people were too brown, and we were viewed as backwards, ignorant, upside down. There was actually a vote, so when they knew we were U.S. territory, the new government noticed that peoples of New Mexico, various peoples, tribes, nations, etc., had stopped sending their kids to the new schools. Do you think it's because people didn't want their kids educated? No, it's because they didn't want their languages, their traditions, their identities, their medicine, their beliefs stripped away. And so they actually put it to a vote. Now, at the time, women couldn't vote, Native peoples couldn't vote. And the people of New Mexico voted 93% against mandatory public schooling from this new government. At which time, the United States government then decided that our people, too brown, too poor, too whatever, were sunk in ignorance and reversed the vote. That is how mandatory public education started in New Mexico. So it's not that hard to see why over 150 years later we are where we are. And I come back to what I said at the beginning, which is that New Mexico, despite tremendous odds, is doing some incredible things. And so you know, one, a governor's administration, or two, isn't gonna cut it. But there are some incredible things happening to work against this centuries of inequities and oppression that has happened, and we need to give it time to work. We need to give our people time to work. We need to continue electing people who look like us, who are New Mexicans, who have New Mexicans' interests at heart. We need to keep showing up to school board meetings, showing up for each other, protecting our communities, and speaking out loudly, and frankly, stop being so damn polite about believing what we believe.
If I could just summarize just go talk to Lori Martinez, would be what I would tell this group of people, to just find Lori Martinez and let her run it as you do.
Other questions? Yeah, we got a bunch over here. Let's start back and work our way up there. Yeah?
My name is Nancy, and first of all, thank all of you for being educators and for advocating. My question is, I had read that as many as a third of school-age children in Las Cruces are not in public schools, probably being homeschooled. And that stat, you know, may be right, I'm not sure, but it's a high number. So my question is, how is the community reaching out? What are the factors that add to that disconnection? And well, that's it. That's the question.
I'll add to your statistic. It's close. There's charter schools as part